Okay guys, so welcome to this video on energy systems. So we're talking about year 11 PE here. So use this video for your test preparation but also for your exam preparation. So watch the video, press pause, rewind it, go back over the content, work at your own pace. Okay, so let's make a start. So going through energy sources, looking at where the body receives or needs energy for. So in terms of what we need energy for, we need energy for all these things. So breathing, sleeping, digesting food, sitting in your chair in your classroom, sprinting for a bus. So all these different activities require energy. More importantly, we need to know what happens to our food once we consume it. So when we eat our food, it travels through the digestive system. So you need to break down the food into a substance or a form we can actually use it for energy production. So the main sources of energy we get our energy from are from food sources such as carbohydrates, fats and proteins. Now, why are vitamins and minerals and water written there? Because the role they play in this digestive system or this digestive process is to break down or assist with the breaking down of carbohydrates, fats and proteins. So we'll start off with carbohydrates. So carbohydrates found in food sources such as pastas, fruits, breads and cereals. They're the primary energy source within the body. So once consumed, carbohydrate is broken down into glucose, which is the immediately usable form of carbohydrates. From here, the glucose is then transported via the blood to the muscles for energy release. So that's all well and good if we use that glucose energy straight away. If not, however, so we're doing an activity and for whatever reason we don't require much energy for that activity, what will happen to that glucose in the blood is it will actually store in the muscles as glycogen. So it stores from glucose into glycogen in the muscles. Now if we have an excess again, so the muscles fill up with these glycogen stores, then what will happen is that excess glucose is now transported to the liver and it will be stored as liver glycogen. So two places where we can store carbohydrates in the form of glycogen in the body are the muscles. When they fill up with their stores, we go to store it in the liver. So glycogen, it's important to know here that glycogen stored in the liver can also be converted back into glucose. So we store it in the muscles as well. Very important to know that once it's stored in the liver there, it can be converted and reused again back into glucose. So if the muscle and liver glycogen stores are full again, so we're consuming a high amount of carbohydrates, it's converted into glucose into the blood, we fill up the muscle stores, we fill up the liver stores, and now we've still got some carbohydrate left over from the meal that we've consumed. This excess is now stored as fat. So what do we call fat? We call the fat cells adipose tissue. So a nice little flow chart here. What happens when we break down carbohydrates? So what happens once the carbohydrate is consumed? It's digested in the body, then it goes into the bloodstream and we find that as blood glucose. Then from here, if there's an excess, we don't use it straight away, it's stored as glycogen in the muscles. If not, again, we've got too much of it in our blood again, it's stored in the liver as glycogen, so backup stores. If we've got an excess still, then it's going to be stored as adipose tissue around our muscles. Fats is the next energy source we're going to look at. So fats are found primarily in foods such as fatty meats, fast foods, butter, cream, dairy products and nuts, things like avocados as well. So once consumed, fats are converted into these things called fatty acids. So similarly to carbohydrates being converted into glucose, fats are converted into these things called fatty acids for transport in the bloodstream. So once they're, so likewise with the glucose, fatty acids, if they're not used for energy production straight away, they're stored in the body as these things called triglycerides. Now these are either stored in the skeletal muscles or in the adipose tissue itself. So they're the secondary source of energy within the body, and I'm going to talk about why they're the secondary source of energy in the body a little bit later on. There you go, there's some sources of fats. So another flow chart, similarly to the carbohydrate flow chart, we're looking at breaking down fats through digestion into the bloodstream as fatty acids. Now from here, They're stored in the muscles as triglycerides. Can be used for ATP resynthesis when oxygen is present. We'll talk about ATP in a minute. But if they're not used for exercise immediately or once these stores are filled up, then they're going to store as fat and adipose tissue. So you can see that both carbohydrates and fats, if there's an excess, they're always going to be stored as adipose tissue, which is something that maybe we don't want. An example of excess fat in the body. Protein, looking at that as the last source of energy, they're the building blocks for our body and the third energy source. So primarily we don't associate protein as an energy source or with an energy source, primarily because of the actual size, the molecular size of the protein molecule is just too big. Proteins play a different role in the body, and we'll look at that in a minute. So proteins are found in food sources such as meats, eggs, chicken, fish and milk, legumes, tofu, all these other things as well. Stored all over the body as amino acids, so we consume protein as a food source and our body breaks it down as amino acids. Now these are stored in the body and they play different roles depending on which amino acid or which protein you've consumed. Also important to note down the bottom here that the proteins are the third energy source and they'll only be used once the other two sources are completely depleted. So in real survival situations where your body's used up all of its fats, all of its carbohydrate stores, and it starts to look at breaking down, essentially it's itself. The body starts to catabolize its own muscle stores. So here again, a flow chart for the third time. Protein digested, stored as amino acids all over the body. Can be used for ATP resynthesis when carbs and fats are depleted, like I said before, and only when those two fuel sources are depleted. But their main primary role is used in muscle repair and building. So it's like an overflow system. There's a good analogy here. We think of the water tank diagrams that I've drawn on the board in class. But here we go again. So muscle glycogen, once that tank fills up, there's an excess stored in the liver. Okay, liver glycogen stores, the backup stores. Once that tank's filled up, then we start to fill up the fat stores, the adipose tissue stores. Now it's also very important to notice, remember, once we fill up these liver glycogen stores, there's a tap, a two-way tap that goes back, and we can tap back into that liver glycogen stores to replenish the muscle glycogen stores if needed. Okay, so just a quick summary of the energy sources. So where do we get our energy from? In particular, our food sources. So carbohydrates, stored as glucose in the bloodstream, glycogen in the muscles and the liver, and an excess will be stored as fat or adipose tissue. Okay, so you can see that where they're stored here. Fats are the secondary energy source. So we look at stored as fatty acids in the blood, triglycerides in the skeletal muscle, and as adipose tissue or fat cells. Protein, we break that down or store them as amino acids, and they're found all over the body. So we've learned about the sources of energy in a brief intro of how we break down food to create the body's energy molecule ATP, which I mentioned before. So the three main energy sources. Number one, the go-to food, the carbohydrate molecule. It's the smallest of the three molecules. It's the easiest thing the body can break down. So very important to note that carbohydrate is the preferred body's fuel source, number one, because of its size. It's easy to break down. The body's smart, it's clever. It wants to break down something easy when we're doing high intensity exercise. Fats are the next favorite food. A gram of fat provides twice as much energy as a carbohydrate and protein molecule, but the trade-off is that it requires more oxygen to burn fat molecules. So if you think about that in terms of what type of intensity is required to burn a fat molecule, it's intensity where oxygen is present. So as long as you can get enough oxygen in whilst you're doing exercise or a sport or an activity, you will always be able to break down fat molecules for a source of energy. Now protein, like I said before, the last resort for energy. So we only use proteins as a last resort. Essentially what your body is doing, if it's breaking down protein, it's actually breaking down their own muscle cells. It's breaking down itself to provide some survival energy. So we'll leave it there for the first video. Check out part 2, which will be on ATP.